this is the true image of Mars. Hey guys, and welcome to this video where I'm going to go over Mars, the Red Dragon, and cosmic catastrophes. So this video is going to be based on Isaiah 51:9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord, awake, as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Art thou not it that hath cut Rahab and wounded the dragon? So this is Isaiah writing in about 800 BC, and he's talking about the ancient of days in generations of old. And this is Rahab, which is a masculine noun, not to be mistaken with the Rahab in the case of Joshua and Jericho, which is the feminine noun who put out the red cord. But interestingly, this has also got to do with a dragon, and we know that the dragon is red, so there is an association between the two. Rahab as the masculine noun is Rahab, and Rahab as the feminine noun is Rahab, so there's a C included. And wounded the dragon. So Rahab and the cutting or the hewing, the destruction of Rahab, is what actually wounded the dragon. So first I'm going to go over something which happens in Job and the cosmic catastrophe that we potentially see there. And a lot can be discovered from the text if you just apply practical thinking to what is actually going on in Job. We know that Job is the oldest book in the Bible, and possibly an antediluvian account or a pre-flood account. He was a very, very wealthy man. It says that he was the wealthiest man in all of the East, and there's no suggestion that that occurred after the flood. So this could potentially be before the flood. Job, the book of Job, is filled with astronomical data. More than any other book in the Bible, Job is full of details about constellations and stars and things which are going on in the heavens and the Mazzaroth. In the book of Job, we see that Satan is roaming the earth, and God asks Satan if he has considered his servant Job, because Job is the most faithful servant in all the world. And Satan then tempts God to say that the only reason why he is like that is because he's so wealthy. And it says that there's a specific day that the sons of God, those are the angels, present themselves before God, and it's probable that that day was Rosh Hashanah, that they came to give their account before God. And this is when Satan tempts God and says that Job wouldn't be faithful to God if God took all of his assets and his wealth away. So God says, let it be, and as long as you keep his life, then Satan can have his way with Job. And I'm going to start from Job 1:13. It says, and there was a day when his sons, that's Job's sons and his daughters, were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and there came a messenger unto Job. So this is after God has given Satan authority to take away Job's wealth and his blessings, and said, the oxen were plowing, and the assets feeding behind them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So Job was an incredibly wealthy man. He had servants, and he had different cattle in different places. And it goes on to say, while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So Job's receiving some pretty bad news, and then he receives the worst news. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Wow. So we see that Job pretty much has everything taken away from him in one single day. But what's going on here? All this happened in one single day? We see attacks from multiple tribes. The Sabaeans and the Chaldeans fall upon the servants of Job and take his cattle away. There's looting of cattle in both of these cases. And we see extreme weather, which has killed his daughters and his sons in one fell swoop, obviously tearing down the house that they were in, which I assume would have been built for normal weather patterns. And we see fire from heaven destroying his cattle in one of the instances. So all in one day. How can this be? I propose that what happened was this was one of the cosmic catastrophes of some sort of a planetary body causing this in one day and causing absolute panic and havoc and looting and extreme behavior by neighboring tribes as people realized the desperation of the situation. So after everything has been taken away from Job, all his wealth and his cattle, in Job 2:3 it says, And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God, and escheweth evil? And still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him, to destroy him without cause. You see, it wasn't Satan that was allowed to do these things to Job. Obviously, Satan moved against Job by commissioning the Lord to do these things to Job in order to see if Job would have his integrity. So Satan, in this case, wasn't in control of the calamity which came upon Job. But if you read on in Job 2:3, when God says that Satan can then take away his health as well, it's Satan himself that gives Job the boils, and it's not God that is in control of that, but Satan himself. So after the dialogue between Job and his friends from chapter 3 to chapter 38, eventually the Lord answers Job himself. And from chapters 38 to 40, the Lord covers a myriad of topics regarding his creation and power. The creation moment itself, when the sons of God, the angels, shouted for joy. He discusses the weather, he discusses clouds, snow, animals, plants, angels, and the sun. And there's more in the book of Job about creation than in the book of Genesis. But then the Lord does something weird. He spends the whole of chapter 41, that is 1/3 of his dialogue with Job, explicitly detailing this Leviathan. Why? Is the Leviathan what caused Job's calamity? God talks about the Leviathan like it is his plaything, like a little bird, tamed and obedient to the commandment of the Lord. And Job then realizes who his indictment is actually directed at. This is God, the creator of all things, and subsequently understands that God gave Job everything, created everything, including his family, friends, and wealth in livestock, and he's entitled to take it all away if he so chooses. And the book of Job is less about the sufferings of man than it is about God's absolute sovereignty in the universe. So what was this Leviathan? We don't really know what it is. We know that Rahab was cut in pieces, and we know that he has wounded the dragon. And in Strong's Concordance, it talks about Rahab being a mythical sea monster, and it talks about the Leviathan also being this the sea monster. But more and more as knowledge increases, I think it's clear that the Leviathan and Rahab were some sort of bodies in the solar system. So discussing Mars and the attributes of Mars, there are certain things which you might find interesting about the planet Mars that most people probably don't really consider. Starting off with a NASA quote, Mars appears to stand between those sets of worlds on the basis of current yet evolving knowledge. Like Earth and Venus, it possesses a myriad of volcanoes, although they probably didn't remain active as long as counterparts on Earth and Venus. On Earth, a single hotspot or plume might form a chain of middle-sized islands such as the Hawaiian Islands as a tectonic plate slowly slides over it. On Mars, there are apparently no such tectonic plates, at least as far as we know today, so when volcanoes formed in place, they had time to become much more enormous than the rapidly moving volcanoes on Earth. Overall, Mars appears to be neither as dead as Mercury and our Moon, nor as active as Earth and Venus. As one scientist quips, Mars is a warm corpse, if not a fire-breathing dragon. Thanks to the ongoing observations by the Global Surveyor and Odyssey orbiters, however, this view of Mars is still evolving. Although Mars is one of the smallest planets in the solar system, Mars has by far the largest volcanoes. 93% of the craters on Mars are in one hemisphere, and 7% are in the opposite hemisphere. Why is this? On Mars, 90% of the volcanoes are located on the huge Tharsis bulge, and 10% located on the Elysium bulge. And these bulges are not located where the craters are. So Mars has no tectonic plates, so the craters impacting, or whatever impacted Mars, caused these bulges to come out and the volcanoes to form themselves. Mars has no crustal elasticity. Its primary mechanism to relieve internal distress is through volcanism. In viewing the early photos of the surface of Mars from Mariner 4, 6, and 7 in the 1960s, astronomers and geologists were astounded at the seemingly impossible. Numerous dry riverbeds were found, some once containing water flowing at the speeds and velocities estimated from 25 miles per hour to 40 miles per hour. And these waters were supposedly flowing on a planet whose normal surface nighttime temperature approaches negative 200 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 128 degrees Celsius. And some more attributes of Mars. The atmospheric pressure on Mars is less than 1/100th of what it is on Earth. In effect, what this means is that the air is more rarefied on the Martian surface as it is at the height of 30,000 meters on Earth. At pressures such as this and at Martian temperatures, liquid water becomes unstable and freezes on the surface. So when they say that there was water on Mars, it doesn't make logical sense. Its surface temperatures almost always are sub-zero, often far sub-zero. Occasionally in equatorial zones, it's summertime. In the middle of a 24-hour day, surface temperatures may rise to 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, so that's not very warm. Some 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius above freezing for a few hours only. But when the middle of the night comes, temperature again plunges to negative 150 Fahrenheit or negative 128 Celsius, even in the summertime. In comparison to the Earth at nighttime, due to radiation with no wind, temperatures may drop as much as 3 degrees per hour. But temperatures during a Martian night can drop from 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius to minus 190 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 87 degrees Celsius in merely 12 hours. This 240 degree Fahrenheit or 110 degree Celsius drop in 12 hours is an average drop of 20 degrees Fahrenheit or 6 degrees Celsius per hour during the Martian night. What an unlikely place the surface of Mars is to expect evidence of onrushing waters. Sudden lakes, or as some have said, water-carrying canals on Mars. It's not possible. The more massive a planet is, the more easily its gravity retains all molecules that can comprise an atmosphere. Conversely, the smaller a planet is, the harder it is for it to retain the lighter gases that could compose an atmosphere. And on small planets, due to the molecular energy of lighter gases, they tend to just float off into space. On larger planets, all gaseous molecules are retained. This is because of gravity. The Moon is too small in mass to retain an atmosphere, and so is Mercury. Venus and the Earth are massive enough, they're about the same size, and readily retain atmospheres. Mars, being 1/9 of the Earth's mass and 9 times the mass of the Moon, is below middling in mass terms of ability to retain an atmosphere. The mass of Mars is only effective in retaining certain heavier gases such as carbon dioxide, argon, neon, and krypton, but not oxygen, water vapor, or nitrogen. Hence, as cited, Mars has rarefied atmosphere, one comprised 97% of only the heavier gases, 95% carbon dioxide and 1.6% argon. It is not possible for Mars to have retained water or air given the size of Mars and given its distance and temperatures as a result of that distance from the Sun. The mystery of Mars. In 1971, NASA's Mariner 9 flew within 2,100 miles of Mars and returned 7,326 images of the surface of Mars. This was the first close-up look that they had. And these images revealed unimaginable scars of catastrophism, indicating a surface of Mars tortured by craters, racked by rifts, battered with bulges, tried by extreme temperatures, and with wild volcanism gone amok. And we're going to have a closer look at Mars and the pictures of Mars as NASA have processed them and as other people have processed the laser data which has come back from Mars. And I think you're going to be quite surprised. And further, mysteriously, most surprising of all, its two tiny satellites, Deimos, which means dread, and Phobos, which means fear, were both badly poxed with pitlets, which means that they were also involved in whatever catastrophism Mars experienced and caused the craters which are on Mars. Those craters are also on the moons of Mars. And astronomers and geologists wondered how Mars could possibly had sudden widespread flood if there's no oxygen, no water vapor, and only a tiny little bit of nitrogen there. Isn't a planetary flood a kind of topic, a tradition, or perhaps even a legend or myth that applies only to Earth? What was it that caused the flood? So next, let's discuss the volcanism on Mars. The tallest volcano on Earth is the Chimborazo volcano in Ecuador at 6,200 meters or 6.2 kilometers. The tallest volcano on Mars is Olympus Mons at 26,000 meters or 26 kilometers. At a Mars to Earth ratio of 3:1, that would make the height of the volcanoes on Mars the equivalent of some 78,000 meters or 78 kilometers high on Earth. Imagine a volcano on Earth 78 kilometers high. In comparison, the tip of Mount Everest is about 12.5% of that 78 kilometers, only sitting at 9.8 kilometers. A large passenger airline flies at a cruising average of 39,000 feet or 11,800 meters. The ozone layer ranges between 15 kilometers to 35 kilometers to the top of the stratosphere at 50 kilometers. So keep in mind that the Olympus Mons is 78 kilometers high, so it would stick out right beyond the ozone layer. Above the stratosphere, where the ozone layer resides, is the mesosphere, where most meteors burn up, which range between 50 and 85 kilometers. So the question is, what would Earth look like from space with a volcano that was 8 times higher than Mount Everest and stuck right out to the mesosphere? Next, I'd like to discuss Donald Patten, who is the author of the book called Mars Earth Wars and also the author of a book called The Flood of Genesis and the Ice Age Epoch. He's a Christian author who wrote Mars Earth Wars and the Biblical Flood and the Ice Epoch. He dedicated his books to Johannes Kepler. Donald Patten was a geographer by training and lifelong interest, and he was born on November 11, 1929. He entered University of Montana in 1947 and engaged upon a series of studies including ancient history, ancient literature, climatology, genetics, geography, geomorphology, mathematics, and philosophy. And this is evident in his books. His research is outstanding. He was also a very astute astronomer and mathematician. And while absorbing humanistic viewpoints, he also began to read the Bible and to reflect upon its claims. In 1948, he experienced conversion to biblical Christianity and through a coincidence was given pulpit duties as a student at a small rural community in the village of Lolo. Following his conversion, this further experience lay in preaching and teaching was almost profound influence in his young manhood, coming in the midst of his studies. So he started to see things from a biblical perspective that he was obviously being taught in his industry as a geographer and the things that he was viewing as a part of his professional. And his biblical view of those things were the cause of his two outstandingly well-researched books. And Mr. Patten received a BA in Geography from the University of Washington in 1951 and his Master's in Geography in 1962. And Mr. Patten and his wife Lorraine have one daughter and 6 sons, and he passed on in 2014. Patten and his catastrophism research, he contends that through the agency of astral principles, the Earth became engaged or engulfed in simultaneous gravitational upheavals and magnetic conflicts in the solar system. There came with suddenness to our fragile spiraling sphere the biblical flood and the ice epoch, and this is what he covers in his book, A View of Ancient Catastrophism and Its Conclusion, Divine Creation, a subject of importance in this age of increasingly intellectual rootlessness. And he obviously recognizes that evolution is a myth, and there's evidence in the solar system of it being bashed up, and he tries to detail what happened, and it's a fascinating read. I'll put the link in the description of the video and you can go through it. And it's over and against the prevailing monopoly of uniformitarian thought, that is evolution, which proposes that eons and eons of time are necessary for anything and everything, both geologically and biologically, that Mr. Patten proposes his view of historical celestial crises, global and solar system catastrophes. And such catastrophes explain many features about several planets, the aspects and the things that we see, huge craters and volcanism on Mars and on Venus, and all of the bashings that we see on Mercury, as well as the rings around Saturn, and he details all those things in his books. Such catastrophes relative to the Earth-Moon system explain the raising up of mountain ranges, sweeping across the face of the Earth in a curved alignment, similar to the mountain patterns of the Moon. And he exposits that this was achieved suddenly and by tidal upheavals within the oceans of centrifugally rotating lava within the Earth's crust. Simultaneously, tidal upheavals engulfing the oceans raised tides of subcontinental dimensions on the Earth's crust, thus the historically recorded deluge or flood. So I don't think we have any idea just how much the flood actually changed the world, and also could have been responsible, or whatever happened in the heavens was responsible for the Earth's current 23.5 degrees axial tilt that we experience at the moment. And in Donald Patten's book Mars-Earth Wars ending in 701 BC, he proposes that Mars was impacted by 2 celestial objects. He calls the first hard matter object Astra, and I just want to say at this point, this is what he has called it himself. Astra could potentially be Rahab, that is mentioned in the Bible, that God has hewn in pieces, and that Rahab may have been the cause of what actually wounds the dragon. So you'll recall the first verse, which was at the introductory slide, that he has hewn Rahab, or he has cut Rahab in pieces and wounded the dragon. It could be that Rahab was destroyed, hewn in pieces, and as a result of that destruction was the subsequent wounding of the dragon. And he says that Astra, as a hard matter object that broke up on the Roche limits, or the gravitational forces of Mars, and that glacis is an ice object that caused the massive sub-24-hour tidal flood on Mars that caused the huge valley that we see on one side of Mars. And the impact of Astra caused the huge Tharsis bulge on which 90% of the volcanoes can be found, in the opposite hemisphere of the crater's impact, where 90% of the craters are found. And we're going to look at a couple of images that will make all of this clear. You'll see all the craters are on one side, and all the volcanoes are on another side. And the impact of Astra theoretically forced the massive volcanoes we see on Mars to burst through the thinnest part of the planet's crust, forming the Tharsis bulge and its volcanoes as a result of there being no tectonic plates on Mars. The impact of glacis, an icy object in space, created the Valles Marineris, a long and narrow valley which abnormally traverses 20% of the planet's surface, like a huge gash out of the side of Mars, just one side of Mars. And Patten supposes that this crater valley was formed in under 24 hours by means of a massive tidal flood, which froze immediately as the planet tumbled to below freezing temperatures. And these impacts changed the catastrophic orbit of Mars, which the ancients were so afraid of as to worship the planet. He also suggests that the catastrophe that happened between Mars, Venus, and Earth changed not only Mars's orbit, but also Earth's orbit and Venus's orbit. And that's the reason why in ancient history we see dozens of civilizations using a 360-day calendar up until such time as about 700 BC, when they all changed to a 365-day calendar. And he goes into a lot of research and detail about when those calendars changed and exactly what they changed to, and says that there is no possible ways that all the ancient civilizations all used to use a 360-day calendar, and then suddenly all of them started using a 365-day calendar. So that would mean that they all made the same mistake and they all counted wrong, and then suddenly they all started counting right all at the same time, which is absurd. And you'll know that the Bible uses a 360-day year as well when we calculate the Hebrew years. Donald Patten's research goes into extreme detail about Mars having had a catastrophic orbit, and that was the reason why the ancients used to worship this planet, because it wasn't just a mere red dot in the sky. It used to come right up to Earth, and something happened that changed that, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. But if you really want to understand it, how his researchers laid this out in explicit forms, then I suggest you read the book, which is in the description of the video. And I just want to add here that I'm not close to the idea of Nibiru being the reason or the cause of this destruction. We're just looking at the pieces that are left behind to us, like pieces of a puzzle, and putting them all together. And I would have been very interested in Mr. Patten's opinion about Nibiru and how Nibiru could have actually affected and caused what he suggests in his book. So we're just putting it all together, but something happened in the solar system, and I believe that Mars was involved in that. So the questions about Mars: what fed the rampaging rivers of Mars? There's no atmosphere, no source of water. Supposed rivers and craters are confined to a very narrow yet hugely elongated space on the planet. Mars cannot retain water vapor due to molecular escape velocities and due to its smallness. And why does the Sumerian commentary from the Epic of Gilgamesh expressly identify Enlil, which was Mars, as the cause of Noah's flood? Gilgamesh's 11th tablet is an extensive description of the onset of Utnapishtim's, or Noah's flood. It is 4 times as long as it is the Genesis account of Noah's flood. It says, "But Enlil shall not come near to the offering, because without reflection he brought on the deluge," that's Mars, "and consigned to my people to destruction. As soon as Enlil arrived and saw the ship, Enlil was wroth. He was filled with great anger against the gods. Has any of the mortals escaped? No man was to live through the destruction." So that's an interesting commentary on Mars being the cause of the flood. And some of the evidence from ancient literature comes from Hebrew Talmudic sources. Those literary resources were gathered by studious Jews while during their Babylonian exile. And it was in roughly 550 BC, almost 2,000 years after Noah's flood. Those Neo-Babylonian sources reflect both earlier Chaldean sources and earlier Sumerian sources, of which original writings or copies thereof were still available on cuneiform tablets. That material relates to the topic of the cause of Noah's flood. And it says, "The flood was produced by a union of male waters which are above the firmament, and the female waters issuing from the earth, oceans. The upper waters rushed through the space left when God removed 2 stars out of the constellation Pleiades. Afterwards, to put a stop to the flood, God had to transfer 2 stars from the constellation of the Bear to the constellation of the Pleiades. There were other changes among the celestial spheres during the year of the flood." So we see clues which are left to us about stars and planetary objects and things which are in the solar system causing the flood of Noah and the deluge. What they were exactly, we can only make a conjecture about, but we do know that the ancient belief was that the flood was caused by something in the solar system. The next clue is Mars moons and Gulliver's travels. In 1726, Jonathan Swift wrote the famous book Gulliver's Travels, and you may have heard Chuck Missler talking about this in some of his videos. Swift was an Irishman, a Protestant who objected strenuously to the unfair treatment of the Catholic Irish by the English nobility in Ireland. And he was a satirist and a boisterous brother in London's John Bull Club. It was a very famous club where all the intellectuals of the day used to gather, where they enjoyed satires and jokes, and especially when they were about the hypocrisy of the proud, the powerful, and the prosperous upper classes in the England of his day. And Isaac Newton and Halley used to hang around in that club as well. Swift writes about the astronomers of Laputa. This is in Gulliver's Travel. He writes fictitiously about these astronomers in this Laputa, an island off the coast of China. And this is a clue to where he may have gained this information on Mars's moons from. The astronomers in his book are on the pleasant island of Laputa in the early 18th century and had superior telescopes to those inferior ones of the Europeans. Thus they had better knowledge of the cosmos. And bear in mind, this is in 1726. And he writes about these astronomers of Laputa. They have likewise discovered 2 lesser stars of satellites which revolve about Mars, whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of his diameters, and the outermost 5. The former revolves in the space of 10 hours, and the latter in 21.5, so that the squares of their periodical times are very near the same proportion with the cubes of their distance from the center of Mars, which evidently shows them to be governed by the same law of gravitation that influences the other heavenly bodies. So what Jonathan Swift has actually given details here of are the 2 tiny little moons which are orbiting Mars, but not only that they exist, but also their distance from the center of Mars itself, which is incredible because in 1726 they didn't have telescopes. So the Laputan astronomers knew what astronomers of Europe didn't know yet, namely that Mars had 2 tiny moons. And Swift was writing in London, where among his friends were Isaac Newton, Edmund Halley, and William Wheatstone, all renowned mathematicians, all competent astronomers, and 1 or 2 were also members of the John Bull Club. But these 2 tiny moons were first viewed and discovered in the modern era in 1877 in a new telescope that the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., that Asaph Hall had set up. So here we have an account of the 2 moons of Mars being detailed, not only that they exist, but how far they are away from the planets, given the gravitational influences of them, 150 years before a telescope actually saw the moons of Mars and confirmed that they really exist. How was this possible? So Phobos, the inner moon, irregular in shape and somewhat fragmented like, has 3 diameters, 12.5 miles by 14.25 miles by 17.5 miles, and 3 diameters of Deimos, which is the other moon, also fragmented in shape, are 6.25 miles by 7 miles by 10 miles. And these 2 tiny moons were well beyond the power of European telescopes and American telescopes until the late 19th century. Nevertheless, 151 years before Hall's discovery, Swift wrote about the 2 tiny moons that Mars has. It is possible that the astronomical archives of Peking, which is in China, in the 1670s and into the 1710s, there were copies of and still extant of ancient stars of Mars with Phobos and Deimos circling it. If so, they were copies of ancient Chinese star charts over 2,400 years old at the time. And his research goes into detail that the Jesuits who were traveling around China had come into contact with this astronomical manuscripts that the Chinese had kept for thousands of years, and that there was a diagram of Mars. So obviously somebody had drawn a picture of this celestial body as it came in close to Earth. Jesuit archives of early China missionaries need scrutinizing for pertinent information. If such a sketch was there, the Jesuit fathers in Peking would have been puzzled and would not known of what to make of such a sketch, so probably copied what they saw from China. And this is why Swift says that the astronomers in China had more information than in his fictitious book. But if a copy of a sketch fell into the hands of Swift, Newton, or Wheatstone, perhaps at the John Bull Club, some interesting interpretations could have resulted. and probably laughs also. A scenario like this is expected where Swift got his inspiration about the Leviathan astronomers and their understanding of the Mars with satellites. And Charles McDowell has researched the subject, and he suspects that the transmission of a Mars Deimos Phobos sketch or sketches came from Peking by a Dr. Cunningham to a Dr. Hans Sloane. And Sloane is very well known. Sloane Square is named after this man, and he gathered samples of thousands of new plants from newly explored lands. He was a great collector, probably one of the greatest collectors in all of history. And for his greenhouse and his herbarium, Sloane's personal collection of 50,000 books was purchased by Parliament in 1753 and became the core of the British Museum. So maybe that picture of Mars is still in his collection. I found this very interesting. Here we see an article dated 22nd of October 2017. NASA just discovered a huge twisted magnetic tail hidden behind Mars. NASA has found an invisible twisted magnetic tail trailing behind Mars as it orbits the Sun, caused by the effects of rushing solar winds, and perhaps explaining more about how the Martian atmosphere escapes into space. So this just sort of adds to the description of Mars being the dragon, and obviously this isn't going to, the tail isn't going to be the tail that falls to Earth, but it just fits the description of the object, which is the sign that represents the dragon itself. So here we can see in the site, which details ancient mythical legends such as Greek legends and Roman legends, that Mars is the Roman name for Eris, which was what the planet used to be called. And Eris is what Hesiod and some of the ancient Greek writers called the planet Mars. And associated with Mars were the shrine guardians, which were monstrous guardians, sacred groves of Eris and Thebes and Colchis. Each had a guardian dragon. So we do see that there is an association with dragons and Mars that goes back to ancient history. I came across this, which was from the NASA Aeronautical Space Research Center, and it's a project which is about Mars sample return using commercial capabilities. And in this document, they're discussing the Mars return samples and the mission to Mars. And all throughout, you can see it's the Red Dragon approach and the Red Dragon. So I found this very interesting, that the Red Dragon is associated with Mars. Here we also see the dragon scales of Mars. In this article, they've taken photos of the surface of Mars, and you can see it has this dragon-like surface, or very much like the skin of a dragon being scaly. And here's a little bit more of a close-up of the surface of Mars, which looks very much like the skin of a dragon. So now let's look at what the text actually says in Revelation chapter 12. Revelation 12, 1-2, and there appeared a great wonder, a simios, a sign in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. So we see the woman is Israel, being represented by Virgo. The crown is the stars, represented by Mars, Mercury, and Venus. And the child is the church, represented by Jupiter. Then in Revelation 12, 3-4, it says, and there appeared another wonder, another sign, a Simeon, not a great wonder, just a wonder, a sign in heaven. It must be a sign. It must be something that we can see. It cannot be a mystery. It must be something that is evident, tangible, and visible. It's a sign. It's not a great sign. And this is where I think people get confused, is they see and behold a great red dragon. The great red dragon is Satan. It says, and behold a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew the third part of the stars from heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So the dragon, Satan, is represented by question mark. Just like we had the woman, Israel, represented by Virgo, the crown, stars, represented by Mars, Mercury, and Venus, the child, the church, represented by Jupiter, dragon, Satan, represented by what? I think what people have done is they've made a mistake in an interpretation here to say that they're looking for this great red dragon and not instead a sign that represents the great red dragon. It says very clearly in Revelation 12, it's just a wonder. It's not a great wonder. There is a great red dragon, but that's not the sign. The sign is simply a wonder. The sign is a lesser sign than the first sign. The second sign is a lesser sign than the first sign. It says simply wonder, Simeon, not great wonder. And then it goes on, obviously, in verse 7, that there was a great war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angel, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great red dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. And he was cast into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So it's telling us in verse 7 exactly who and what the red dragon is. But that is represented by the sign. So that sign must be something that we can see. And in Revelation 12:5 it says, and she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And again, the second sign is not great. It is lesser than the first sign. The same logic should be applied. Something that we actually see in the heavens which represents the dragon. It must be a sign visible in the heavens. So I propose that the Mars-Venus conjunction on October the 5th was that second sign. And that second sign was the first conjunction after the Revelation chapter 12 sign. It was a very important and unique event in the world of astronomy. So here we can see a video of an astronomer who had taken images of the very recent Mars-Venus conjunction. Here you can see Regulus in Leo, and down at the bottom left, and you can see Venus and Mars. So astronomers were very interested in this conjunction. Here's another picture of Mars and of Venus on cloudynights.com, an astronomy website, and another picture of Mars and Venus. And on earthsky.org it says watch for Mars and Venus this week. This was on October the 4th, so this was a rare conjunction that people were referring to. And on skyandtelescope.com, Venus and Mars kiss at dawn. That was on October the 4th, saying be sure to set the alarm so you don't miss the squeaky tight conjunction of Venus and Mars Thursday morning. They'll stay close through the weekend. This was a very rare occasion, and especially happening in Leo. It won't happen again for another 300 years. And on astronomy.com it says Thursday the 5th of October, Venus and Mars will be just 0.2 degrees apart, about half the full moon's diameter before dawn. The two planets haven't been this close since November 1995, so it's definitely a rare event, and especially in Leo, you won't see this in Leo for a very, very long time again. It was an extremely rare event reported by many astronomy sites, and note that the Revelation chapter 12 sign wasn't. Venus represents Jesus, we know that because the Bible tells us, and Mars represents the dragon's war against him, that is the celestial war in heaven. The sign is representing something which is a story which is occurring that we know of in the Bible. In Luke 10:18, Jesus says, and he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning falling from heaven. The celestial war, Mars represents war. Jesus Christ is the bright and morning star, Venus, and Mars is warring against him. In Isaiah 14:12 it says, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? And in 1 Peter 5 it says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may desire. Satan has been kicked down to earth already. He's already roaming the earth, looking for who he can devour. He's in the midst with his fallen angels. He's just not in the same dimension as us, but he's certainly doing his wickedness while he's here. So the representation of the dragon and the celestial war in heaven, that is what is being spoken about the red dragon. And in Job 1, we know that Satan is roaming the earth. It tells us, and the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and walking up and down it. And then after the conjunction, Venus continues on to the man-child, the body, the church, and Jupiter. So Venus is now moving its way towards Jupiter. It's getting closer and closer to Jupiter. Venus is the bright and morning star, as I said, Jesus Christ, and it's moving towards the body, the striped Jupiter with the massive storm, which represents the pierced side of the Lord. That's his body. Mars then continues on to represent the dragon, and it's going now moving down towards the front of the woman. Consideration of the dragon. I put a table together with some questions to see if certain things can fit as the sign. And the first question is it something that we can see? The answer for Nibiru or whatever you want to put in there is no. We don't know what it is. We don't know if it really exists, and it's really hypothetical at the moment. As far as the Mars and Venus conjunction and Mars then going on to represent the dragon, yes, it's definitely something we can see. Is it a sign as determined by Scripture? Nibiru or whatever else you want to put in there is no, it's not. Again, hypothetical. Whereas the Mars and Venus conjunction, yes, we can see the sign as it is determined by Scripture. If Nibiru was to be a sign, if the red dragon was going to be Nibiru, we know that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. So unless that thief in the night is coming to rob a house and arriving in a jumbo 747, we can't expect something like Planet X or a planetary body to be a sign. It must be a sign and not the catastrophe that people are supposing the red dragon is. Is it red? Nibiru or whatever, we don't know. We don't know what color it is. We don't know. There's no description of it really. Everything is hypothetical again. And as far as Mars is concerned, yes, it is red. Does it breathe fire like a dragon? We don't know. Nibiru, we don't know anything about it. We don't know its cosmological properties, and we don't even know if it exists truly. And Mars, yes, volcanoes are the largest in the solar system. It is a fire-breathing dragon as described by NASA themselves. Does it look like a dragon? We don't know as far as Nibiru is concerned. Mars, yes, it does look like a dragon. It has scales that look like a dragon. Does it have a tail? We don't know as far as Nibiru is concerned. Mars, yes, we do know that it has a tail. Previously discussed, we now know that Mars has a magnetic tail. Does it have ancient dragon history associated with it? Nibiru, no, it doesn't. Nibiru is a fairly recent topic of conversation. Some people have said that it comes from the Anunnaki and all these historical references, but in actual fact 20 years ago nobody was talking about Nibiru. And in the case of Mars, yes, the ancient history with Ares and Mars refer to a dragon and it being directly associated with Ares and Mars. Does it have modern dragon association with it? Yes, it does. For Nibiru's perspective, they obviously recognize and people think that Nibiru is the dragon, but it still remains hypothetical, and in conspiracy theories that is what Nibiru is the dragon. But as far as NASA and SpaceX are concerned, they refer to Mars as the red dragon, and we know this because we have evidence of them calling their projects the red dragon. And is it still in the Revelation chapter 12 sign? No, Nibiru hasn't arrived yet. It doesn't factor at all. There's nothing that we can see or look at and say that's what the red dragon is. It's purely hypothetical. As far as Mars and Venus conjunction, yes, it's moving towards the front of Virgo. And is it chronological? No, Nibiru hasn't even arrived. It doesn't even exist as far as I'm concerned. It's purely hypothetical, theoretical, and it's out there in Never Never Land, in fiction and fantasy. And as far as the Mars-Venus conjunction and Mars representing the dragon going forward, yes, it's perfectly chronological. We saw the sign, which was the celestial war in heaven. between the dragon, which is Satan, against the Messiah. That's what it's all about, the celestial war against Jesus Christ. And it is perfectly chronological. If the sign was the Mars-Venus conjunction, and Mars continues on to represent the dragon that is warring in heaven, it's perfectly chronological and moving towards the front of Virgo, as mentioned before. So I think all these things give a very strong case for Mars-Venus conjunction being that sign, and then Mars carrying on to represent the dragon and move towards the front of the Virgin as we see it doing today. So next, let's have a look at some images of Mars. There are two types of image sources from Mars. One is the photographical images, obviously, that we see, and the second is laser-derived topography. MOLA is the Mars Orbiter Laser Altimeter, an instrument currently in orbit around Mars on the Mars Global Surveyor spacecraft. The instrument transmits infrared laser pulses towards Mars at a rate of 10 Hz and measures the time of flight to determine the range of the MGS spacecraft to the Martian surface. And determining the height of the surface features on Mars is important to mapping it. To this end, MGS carried a laser altimeter on board. So the range measurements are used to construct a precise topographic map of Mars that has many applications and studies in geophysics, geology, and atmospheric circulation. And the laser data made available to the public means that researchers may render the images from the published archive data. So they have all this laser data, not photographs, but laser data. And students can take that data and then compile an image created from the data that the laser gathered by scanning Mars. And images can be created from the true topography data of the planet Mars as published by NASA's MOLA. So here we see the typical image of Mars, which has been released by NASA. I'd like you to pay close attention to the volcanoes, which they suppose are accurate in this image. Unfortunately, NASA is an inherently dishonest organization. As I think most people know, NASA was formed by the Nazis in an Operation Paperclip, that they took the Nazi scientists and basically formed NASA. So we can't expect any sort of resemblance of truth to come out from NASA. And if you have a close look at this image and other images I'm going to show you, they've doctored this, and this has been flattened out as far as these well-known volcanoes are concerned. Here's another image which we can get a little bit closer and have a look at the volcanoes. So bear in mind the height of the volcano, as I explained earlier in the video, was 72 or 75 kilometers high, and that's almost the same case for the other volcanoes as well. Does that look like this has been rendered correctly, or does it look like they've actually flattened this out, these volcanoes? So unfortunately, NASA has the benefit of being able to edit these images before they release them to the public. But with the Mars Orbiter Laser Altimeter, the MOLA data, people can take that laser data and compile an image from that laser data to create a true topography of the planet. So here's looking at another image, and you can see, I mean, if you look at this, you can see that this image has been photoshopped. They've done something to this image. It's not what it should be. Looking at these volcanoes, look how flat this volcano looks. This is not the original. Let's look at another one. Look at how flat this is. These volcanoes are 20 to 28 kilometers high on a planet that is 1/3 the size of Earth. So that would be the equivalent, as mentioned before, about 72 kilometers. Does that look like it's 72 kilometers high? Does that look like it's 72 kilometers high or thereabouts? And looking at this valley which has been created here, it just looks like they've modified this image. If you have a look at it really closely, it looks like they have rendered it, they've flattened it out, they've smoothed the surfaces of this image. Now you have to ask yourself, why would they do this? Why would they actually go and smooth the surfaces out so that it's not a true reflection of what the planet is? And I think if you look at the true rendering of what the planet actually is by somebody who has taken that MOLA data, you'll realize why they've done this. This is the true image of Mars rendered and compiled by that laser data. So you may ask yourself, why would they do this? Why would they smooth the planet out before sending the images out? And the answer to your question, I believe, is the fact that here you can see these huge gashes out of the planet and these massive craters, whereas on this side there's basically nothing that's happened to the planet, and these massive volcanoes which have popped out just on this side, not on the other side, which is the opposite side of where all the catastrophe has happened. So this is a case against evolution, and that's why I believe they've smoothed the planet out, because you can't look at this and say that this has evolved. There's no ways that you can look at this and say that something catastrophic hasn't happened to this planet. How can you suggest that this is running rivers of water which have evolved over millions and millions of years and not some sort of catastrophic event? Look at these valleys. They go into nothing. They start from nothing here, and then there's this sudden huge gash where all these massive craters are poxed one side of the planet, and then nothing on the other side of the planet but this is actually a bulge where these volcanoes have popped out, where the crust of Mars was the weakest because it has no tectonic plates, so these things have popped out. Now imagine what this thing looked like if it was on a close trajectory to Earth, and the gravitational forces were pulling all the volcanic lava out of these volcanoes which were pouring down. You can imagine how terrified the human beings must have been on Earth to see this thing. And also the destruction of the side here. Remember what the first verse of the video which I showed you was. It says, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Art thou not it that hath cut Rahab?" We see in the in between Mars and Jupiter, we see the asteroid belt. Could that potentially be Rahab? Cut up, hewn into pieces, and that's the evidence of Rahab. And wounded the dragon. Did Rahab wound the dragon? Is Mars that dragon that it has wounded? Is this the wound that it's talking about? I don't know, but it certainly seems to fit given Donald Patten's research and the evidence that we see in the solar system. So I think it's a compelling reason and a compelling fit to say that Mars is not only the red dragon, but it was wounded by the destruction of Rahab, and Rahab has caused this catastrophe that we see on Mars, which pushed out the volcanoes. And human beings actually saw this happen, this catastrophe that set Mars into its current orbit as we see it now, and away from its catastrophic orbit that it used to be in. So I'm not saying that Nibiru doesn't exist. Very much so, Nibiru could have actually been involved in this whole saga, because the Jews say that there were 2 stars that God removed. So potentially Nibiru could have been involved, but I stick to the suggestion that Mars is the red dragon, and it's the best fit, it's the best representation. And please guys, don't call Mars Michael. If Michael is Mars, then Michael is ugly. And I believe that Michael is probably a very, very beautiful angel, and somewhat probably offended the fact that he has been called a poxed and warty looking planet, which represents war, and it is ugly.